Hey everybody, Adam Volk here again with Social School, and we are here for module number 2 of our search engine optimization course. So let's just chat a little bit about what we can expect and what we covered in module 1 just as a refresher. So in module 1, we just chatted a little bit about the definition of SEO, how search engines work, how the Google algorithm works, and we chatted a little bit about the SERP, search engine results page, what we can see with those particular results, and some of the kind of key elements that are being pulled in. We also chatted a little bit about some of the most common SEO myths, and we learned a little bit more about the differences between SEM and SEO, and also chatted about the big 3 areas of SEO. Each one of these is going to be covered in this particular course. So the big 3 are really crawlability, content and keywords, and link building. So one of those first big pillars that we're going to cover is crawlability. So that's this module here, and what we're going to look at for this particular module is we're going to learn about internal linking, why this is important to SEO, why this is something we have to do. We're also going to chat a little bit about the types of errors that search engines look for. We're particularly going to look at one of the biggest errors and just how we can fix that. And we're going to talk about the importance of sitemaps. We'll learn a little bit more about what those are and how we can use them. And we're going to talk about duplicate content and why Google actually loathes this type of issue and how we can avoid it and how we can fix it. And then we're going to talk about the importance of crawl budget, which we touched on a little bit in the first module, but we're going to chat a little bit more on how we can maximize and capitalize on crawl budget to get the most value from our SEO program. So let's jump into this. Just the one caveat that I want to kind of set out here for this particular module is that this is the most technical module of the course. But this is foundational work. We need to make sure our site is crawlable before we can move to these other elements. So this is the most technical, but bear with me. I promise we're going to get through this, and even if you have no experience with websites or coding or any of those things, that is perfectly fine. We're going to walk through each of these things, and if you need to take some time and kind of digest it, you might want to do that for this particular module, just because it's a little bit more on the technical side, but I promise we're going to get through this, and you are going to be able to have a solid understanding of these technical elements as the module is wrapped up. So let's jump into it. All right, so crawlability. What exactly is that? The one thing we want to think about from an SEO standpoint is before you walk, you gotta crawl. So it's the first thing we need to do. A lot of people think of SEO in terms of keywords and content, and that's important. That's really important stuff. We're going to talk about that in Module 3, in fact. But before we can get to that, we have to make sure our site is crawlable. If it's not, all this great content that we're producing is just going to get ignored and unfound by our users and our target audience. So we need to set this foundational work in terms of our SEO program. So what do I mean by crawlability? Well, really, crawlability is all about making it for Google to crawl our website and understand our content. Remember that Google is essentially just following links. That's all search engine results really are at the end of the day, is just a series of interconnected links. That's why it's called the World Wide Web. So if we can make it easy for Google to crawl those links and understand our content, then we are definitely going to increase our chances of ranking well and driving more users, and ultimately our main goal of getting more conversions from our search program. So again, even if we have the most awesome content on the planet, if Google can't find it, no one is going to get to this content. So it's so important for us to do this foundational work. So how do we make our site crawlable? So remember our last module, we chatted a little bit about what Google's actually like. Google is an incredibly powerful, incredibly smart machine, but at the same time, it's also incredibly dumb and a little bit lazy. So remember our definition, sort of like Google's an idiot savant. It's capable of doing all these advanced calculations, but sometimes it can't do just basic things and it needs to be told exactly what to do. It's sort of like a socially awkward mathematician. So that's the way I like to think of it sometimes, where it's capable of these advanced calculations, but then doesn't understand some really basic things that it needs to know just to be able to understand our content. So the more we can help Google out, the better our results are going to be. And that's really what SEO is. It's just helping Google understand our site, helping Google get the information it needs. If you can help Google, they'll help you back. So that's really the foundation of SEO. So that's all well and good as a kind of high-level definition, but how do we actually do this? How do we actually make our site crawlable? So there's actually a whole range of things you can do. You can get very, very technical doing this kind of work, but at the end of the day, just from a basic standpoint, if we can focus on 5 key things to make our site crawlable, these are the biggest bang for our buck things that we can do from a kind of entry-level SEO program that's going to get some really, really strong results for us. And we'll chat about what each of these actually is. So the first is internal linking. The second is to limit our errors. The third is using sitemaps. The fourth is removing duplicate content and making sure we don't have additional duplicate content for that matter. And then the last is saving crawl budget. So let's jump into internal linking. All right. So let's think about our website and imagine for a second, if you will, that all of the links between the pages on our site are water pipes. So a link from page 1 to page 2, that's a pipe. It's a water pipe. Now let's imagine that our website is all these interconnected pipes. And if we imagine Google as being water, when water is poured into those pipes, it's just naturally going to flow from one pipe to the next. If a pipe isn't connected, the water's not going to reach that. And if a pipe is too deep underground or it's too far away from where that water is being poured in, only a trickle of water might actually reach that particular pipe. So that's really how we want to think of Google and our websites. Our website is essentially just a series of links, which are really pipes, and we want Google to be able to flow through those links, to flow through those pipes as easily as possible. So if a page is not connected somehow, it's not linked through to other pages, Google can't get to that page. Or if a page is too far down, you have to click through 6 different pages above it to get to it, Google might not reach that too. So that's really a good way to think about how Google actually crawls a site. It's essentially flowing just like water would through a series of pipes. So with that in mind, here are a few things that are really going to make a huge difference. In fact, there has been a large amount of focus on internal linking as kind of the unsung hero of SEO, and a really simple thing that you can do that can have a huge impact on your site. Because bear in mind, for Google to understand our site, it has to be able to crawl all these pages. And the only way to do that is if those pages are linked together. So with that in mind, a really good technique is to have more than one link to a page. And by that I mean, say we have page E. It would be great to have a link from page A to page E, page B to page E, page C to page E, and page D to page E. So we have multiple pages all linking off to one single page. So that's just going to make it easy because we never know how Google's going to crawl our site. So we want to cover our bases and make it as easy as possible for Google to get to that final page however we can. So lots of links on your site where it makes sense to different pages. The other thing you want to make sure we do is have no more than 3 clicks to reach any page from our homepage. So this is called page depth. So if it takes a user 5 clicks from the homepage to get to something, that means it's potentially going to take Google a long time to get to that page because, again, thinking of it like water flowing to different pipes, it might not reach that page because it's so far down. And Google might just give up and say, hey, we're not going to bother going that far down because users are unlikely to get down. So just bearing that in mind, trying to keep a structure as flat as you can and probably no more than 3 levels. The other thing you're going to want to think about doing with internal linking is anchor links. Using text in your anchor links. So rather than saying, see our shoe inventory page at blah, 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 and having the whole URL, you would say, see our shoe inventory, and using keywords, which we'll talk a little bit more about in Module 3, but just linking off from a particular keyword to a new page. Because remember, Google is an idiot savant, and if it can follow and see, oh, this is saying shoe inventory, and it links to a shoe inventory page, aha! That is going to be a big clue and a big help to Google, and a surprisingly effective way to ensure that Google understands content and can crawl links. Then another really simple but easy way to get internal linking down is to make sure that you have a list of links to the most important pages in the footer of your site. And you'll often see this on other websites. If you poke around and just take a look at what other brands are doing, you'll see that a lot have a list of all of the pages that are really important to their site. In some cases, even every single page on their site just found in the footer of their website. And so in some cases, that's a global element that no matter what page you go to, you're always going to see in the footer it has those links. And that just makes sure another way that we can really make sure that Google's going to be able to crawl those pages and get to what it needs to get to. And then just kind of consider how a user is going to get to a particular page. Bearing in mind, again, we want to have multiple ways for Google to reach that page. If there's only one way for Google to get to that, say it's a drop-down menu, navigational item from the top of the nav menu, or it's a single link from one page, that's the only way to get to that final page. That's not great. We want to have multiple ways, and just thinking about how users, kind of putting yourself in a user standpoint and thinking of this almost from a user experience standpoint, just thinking about, well, how would somebody actually get to this page if they landed on the home page? Or how would they reach my target page if they landed on some other random page? Is it easy to get to this particular page? Because really, Google rewards pages that are easy to navigate to from a usability standpoint, and also that are easy for Google to crawl and get to. And then really important, make sure there are no orphan pages. And by that I mean a page that lives off in isolation by itself and doesn't have any links to it. So again, if we think of our water analogy and our pipe analogy, if Google can't follow those pipes and there's one pipe that just isn't connected to the main line, well, the water's not going to reach that pipe, and Google will not reach our page if that's the case. Now, that being said, you may want to have orphan pages if you're running a paid advertising program and you don't want Google to get to that page. The only way that Google can get to it is if from an ad. That's a fine tactic if you're doing something like that. But if you're trying to get a page indexed and crawled by Google, you definitely do not want it to be orphaned. You want to make sure that it's as accessible as possible. All right, and this is just kind of a snapshot of how we want to think about our websites from an internal linking standpoint. And some of you might be familiar with looking at things like this from sitemaps. This is actually something that user experience and information architects construct on a daily basis to understand websites. Literally, before we begin building out websites, a lot of these professionals will just take a piece of paper or use sitemap tools to literally visually figure out how all of the pages are connected. And for SEOs, that's also really great because we can use tools to crawl and do more complicated things to kind of understand, but it really helps crystallize in our minds how our site looks and how it connects if we can use this type of diagram to kind of wrap our heads around what's actually occurring on our website. So just a really good way to kind of think about your overall internal linking structure and trying to find some opportunities to really improve your linking. And I would even say for this particular example, this is not even necessarily the greatest example. It's just kind of an indication of an overall sitemap. But there's lots of ways we could be doing much more internal linking within here just to make it as easy as possible for that Google water to flow through these different pipes and reach the pages that it absolutely needs to, and making it as streamlined as possible for Google to reach every page that's important to us. You'll also note in this example, there is really no more than 3 levels, so the page depth here is really, there's 3 levels to it. In terms of users clicking to get to a particular page. So we wouldn't probably want to have any other sub-pages underneath this because that's a lot of clicks for users to take from our home page. So one other thing about internal linking is just if we think of it again as water, one thing we want to think about is redirects. So if we think of these as pipes, redirects are something's happened with the pipe and we want to redirect that water to flow to another pipe while we fix the pipe, or maybe that pipe's just permanently broken. So when we think of redirects, they actually pass along 90% or more of the SEO value from one page to another. So why would you use something like this? Well, redirects are commonly used when you create a new site. So say you have an old site, it's about men's shoes, and I'm moving over to a new site on men's shoes. Well, my old site's been around for 10 years, and I want to make sure that all the great SEO value it's acquired in Google rankings and traffic, I don't want to lose that. So I want to pass along all that value from that old site to the new site. So if you didn't do this, what would actually happen is all of the value that you've lost, even if you have the exact same domain name, so if we have, jimmyshoes.com, and I still move over to a new Jimmy Shoes, even if I do that, if I don't have redirects from specific pages, old pages to new pages, all of the value of the old site is going to be lost. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when they create a new website. They do not set up redirects that pass along the value from their old site to their new site. So, now that we kind of have an understanding of what redirects are, just to add a little bit of a twist to these, there's actually two types of redirects. They are permanent redirects and temporary redirects. Permanent redirects are more commonly known as 301 redirects, and they're called that because the response code that they return is a 301. And temporary redirects are known as 302 or 307 redirects because that's what they're returning. So those are really the two basic types of redirects. In fact, they're the only types of redirects. So how do these redirects work? So let's imagine that all of our links are roads. I'm going to switch gears here and imagine we're roads now. So roads are our links from our sites, and redirects are signs along the way. So if a car reaches a 301 permanent redirect, the sign would say on our hypothetical link road, this road is closed forever. It's permanently closed. Go this way instead from now on. And the user would, the person driving that car is never going to go back to that old road because they know it's closed forever. Now, if we imagine a road sign next to our link being a 302 or a 307, those temporary redirects, the sign would be, this road is closed for now. Maybe it's under construction, maybe something's happening with it, but it's just temporarily closed, and it's probably going to open again someday. So go this way instead for now on. So in theory, both of those redirects are going to pass along value regardless of whether they're permanent or temporary. They are going to pass along value from one page to the next, but Google prefers 301 redirects, and it doesn't like 302s or 307s as much. And that's because Google's thinking, well, if you have a temporary redirect, then presumably your site, it's going to fix the old page at some point, and that link's going to follow through. So Google doesn't like those as much because a lot of times what happens is people will accidentally put those in. It's often the result of a coding issue, and then they never go back and fix it. So sometimes Google may not pass along value from one page to another if you're using a temporary or a 302 or 307 redirect. So try to avoid using those if you can, and instead always make sure to use 301 permanent redirects. And you can chat with your development team to fix this, but we'll also chat a little bit about ways to do this, and this might make a little more sense too when we look at some of the tools today. All right, so now we have an idea about how internal linking is important. We're thinking of it like water. Then we're also thinking about redirects, so passing along the value from an old page to a new page, and that there's two types, temporary and permanent, and we always want to go with the permanent option. But what ends up happening in a lot of sites is having something known as redirect chains. So this is where you have a series of redirects, and it looks something like this. Page A redirects to page B, which then redirects to page C, which finally ends up on page D. So those should be avoided because remember, our redirects actually only pass 90% of the SEO value from one page to the next. So we're diluting it every time we redirect a page. And it also slows down load times. So this is often accidentally created when somebody makes a new page and or it's a development issue that occurs, but we will see this happen a lot where there's redirects that occur. And in the example above, what we would really want to do is instead of having page A go to page B, go to page C, go to page D, we would just want to redirect page A to page D and skip out all those middle steps in between. And again, this is all about making it as easy as possible for Google to get to where it needs to go to understand our site. And you can chat with your developer about if how to actually address these particular issues, but this is a really important foundational thing that you need to make sure you're doing when it comes to SEO. All right, so how can we see all the links on our page. So I would like to introduce you to your new SEO best friend. This is a tool that a number of SEOs have been using for many, many years. It is a very awesome and very free tool. So let's take a look at SEO Meta in one click. So this is a free Chrome extension, and it shows you all the SEO data you need. It's just in one convenient place. It's super easy to use. And so what I would like you to do right now is, after that we finish this slide here, pause the video and Google SEO Meta in one click and go to the Chrome web store to download this tool because it is fantastic. So go ahead and Google that right now, and let's download SEO Meta in one click right now. All right. So now that you've got it downloaded, what we're going to do here is you're going to click on the SEO Meta in one click Chrome extension, which you can see in the right-hand corner of your screen. And we're going to click on that, and I can show you what it looks like here if you'd like to take a look. So we can go here into all the tools that I use, and it's just going to pull up and load all of my information here. And I can click on this particular tab right here, which is called the Links tab, and I can look and see all of the different links that exist on this particular page. So a really, really cool way to just see exactly what's happening, and I can also see the total number of links, internal unique links, and links that don't have titles. In this case, a title being a little anchor linked description of what the URL would actually be for that particular link. So a really cool way to just get a general sense of from a snapshot perspective of all the internal linking that exists on your website. So, as our first exercise for module number 2, what I'd like you to do right now is to take a step back, and before we start thinking about complicated tools and doing technical crawls and all that stuff, just think about what your site looks like from a sitemap standpoint. So what we're going to do is draw a map, just like I showed you earlier, in terms of all of the pages on your site and how they are linked together. Now, if you have a huge site, it's probably going to take you a while to do this, so really just start with kind of the high-level pages, and you're going to start with your home page, then identify all of the pages that link off to that, and then just think about all of the different ways that users will have to actually reach a particular page and make it easy for Google to find that. So let's just take a few moments here and draw out from a visual standpoint what our site looks like, how those pages are connected together. And bear in mind, this isn't just an arbitrary exercise. This is something UX people and information architecture people and content specialists and SEOs do on a daily basis before they dig into those tools to really understand what's occurring with their site and really be able to identify where there might be areas that need a little bit of more internal linking love so that both Google and users can find the information they need. So let's take a couple of minutes to do this, and then we will jump back up onto the rest of the module. All right, so we've talked a lot about internal linking. Now, a lot of information to cover there. This is, again, as complicated from a technical standpoint as we're going to get when it comes to internal linking. So the next thing we want to talk about is limiting errors on our site. So Google will crawl a website, and again, it's just following links, and then it is going to look for errors. Now, Google will actively penalize sites with errors, not because Google thinks that, hey, this is bad for our system, it's causing our system problems. No, it penalizes sites with errors because they offer a poor user experience. And there are literally hundreds of different types of errors that you can encounter when it comes to a website. But for the purposes of this course, we are going to talk about the biggest, baddest error of them all. And that is a 404 page not found error. This is literally the worst error you can have in the eyes of Google, and it's considered a major issue that you need to get fixed as quickly as you can. So here's an example of a 404 from the social school page. So this is saying you probably encountered these all the time, but this is a page you can't find what you're looking for. this page does not exist. Please go to our home page. So you've probably seen these many times over the years. Very common to run into these pages. So what are they? So what actually occurs with the 404 is, again, remembering that Google is just following links to understand our content. What's actually happened is that someone has linked to a page, either internally or externally, and that page no longer exists. So it's a dead link. That link goes absolutely nowhere. It hits a brick wall. If we think of our pipe analogy, literally the pipe would, bam, just run up into a wall, and it used to go perfectly off to another pipe, and now it's hit a dead end. And Google's going to crawl that link and reach that same dead end. So Google hates these kind of errors because they are the worst user experience you can imagine. If you think about what you might have even encountered these when you're doing poking around on websites, and it's very frustrating if oh, hey, this looks awesome, a great article that I'm going to click on here, and hey, read this article, click this link here, and I click the link, I'm already excited to go, and what the hell, this page doesn't exist anymore. This is a terrible website, and the people that linked to it are terrible for sending me to a dead page. So this is a really poor experience, and not only that, but it's an extra insult to Google because it makes it harder for Google to index a site because it hit that dead end. So that's why these are considered one of the worst errors you'll ever encounter from an SEO standpoint. So how do you fix these errors? Well, it's a simple way to do it. You add a 301 redirect to a similar page. So say we had an article about flower arranging, and now that article no longer exists, and it's a 404, but there's a whole bunch of links that have been driving into it. I'm going to want to add a 301 redirect from the dead page to a correct live page, just to make sure that users are going to where they actually need to, and it's going to pass along all that link value. So you can ask a developer to add a redirect, or certain platforms such as WordPress, they actually have 301 redirect plugins. Squarespace also has built-in 301 redirect functionality, and it is not as complicated as it sounds. It's literally saying, hey, here's the old page, redirect to this new page, and you just drop it in, and that's all there is. There isn't any crazy coding or detailed fixes really required that would necessarily need a super expensive or complicated developer. This is a really easy thing to do in WordPress and Squarespace and a lot of other content management systems. But setting that up is a great way to just make sure that you are addressing any 404 errors with your website. All right, next we're going to chat a little bit about sitemaps. So sitemaps are really just roadmaps that are going to help Google understand our site. Because remember, Google's an idiot savant. It's capable of doing advanced billion calculations per second, but it's also kind of can't find its way out of a paper bag sometimes. It's very smart and very dumb at the same time. So a sitemap is just our way to make sure that Google does not get lost and it finds what it needs to do, and it's going to pay attention to the most important pages on our site. So there's really two types of sitemaps: HTML sitemaps and XML sitemaps. Now, that sounds scary, seeing a bunch of weird code and acronym like XML being used, but I promise you these are a lot more simple than they actually sound. So, HTML. This is a bit dated when it comes to SEO, but they can still be useful. And essentially, an HTML sitemap's just a single page on your website that has a full list of all the other pages on your site. And you're going to keep this in the root directory of your website, so it's really one click away from anything. So it would be yoursite.com/sitemap. That's really where this HTML sitemap page would live. And just as an example, you'll notice the URL for this page. This is from the city of Calgary, so it's /pages/sitemap. And this is just literally a list of all of the pages that they feel are most important. Now, some people might potentially go to this page, and this page is found, you can actually get to it from the footer of the City of Calgary, calgary.ca website. It has a little link there that says sitemap, and some people might use this to navigate instead of using the navigation bar at the top of the page. But really, this is primarily used for Google to just have another way for Google and other search engines to crawl all these pages and just make sure they're going to get to where they need. But some people will actually use the sitemap as a navigation just to kind of look and see if they can find a page, especially if it's a very large navigation bar at the top of a website. But that's really as simple as it is. You could just make a page called sitemap page, and then just put links to all the pages on your site in that on that page, and just make sure they're linking off. And you'll note they've done a great job here. Instead of just having the URL for, say, specialty teams or the statistics page, instead of just having the URL for that, they say statistics and then link off to it. So that's going to A, help Google crawl the page because it's going to follow that link, and B, it's going to help Google understand that that is the statistics page because it uses the word statistics in that particular link. So that's really all there is to basic HTML sitemaps. Now the next one sounds a little more complicated, but it's actually still pretty simple. So an XML sitemap is really one of the most effective ways to get your site indexed by Google. And all this is a list of all the websites you want Google to index and crawl. And you're going to list them in the order of most important to least important. And what you can do is you can submit this sitemap to Google Search Console, which we'll talk about a little bit later, just to get your site indexed even more quickly. And what you want to do is every time you update a page to your website, so you either add a new page or you change the URL of an existing page, you're going to want to update this sitemap and then submit it to Google. And they look more complicated than they actually are. They're really just a very, very simple file, and they're super valuable for SEO. So you want to make sure yours is accurate. This is what they look like. Here's one for bestbuy.com. So you'll see that the URL for this is bestbuy.com/sitemap.xml. So it is a file that is stored on their root directory, an XML file. And all this is simply doing is showing all of the pages, or different, in this case, there are other secondary sitemaps that they want to have Google crawl. So it's just a list of various URLs that you want Google to crawl when it comes to your own website. And they're listed in order of priority. So whatever I feel is the most important is going to be the first one that they crawl, and other ones are going to be less important following that. And that's all it is. So how can we see if we have an XML sitemap? Every website should have an XML sitemap. What we can do is use our handy SEO Meta in one-click Chrome extension. And if you go to the Summary tab, which is the very first tab, you'll actually be able to see at the bottom of the Summary tab, there is a little clicking section called sitemap.xml. And I'll just show you what that looks like here. And if we were to click on our SEO Meta in one click, I'm on the Summary tab here. I can just click down on the XML sitemap, and it's going to take me to that particular page and show me all the information that's actually included in that particular sitemap. And so that's really all you really need to do to actually be able to access a particular sitemap. Now, if you have any issues in getting this put in place, or want to make sure that it's functioning correctly, you can always talk to your developer about doing this, but it's a very, very simple file, and really all it is just a list of all of your URLs in order of most important to least important that you want Google to crawl. Now, one thing about XML sitemaps too is you don't necessarily have to include every page on your site, only the priority pages that you really want to make sure that Google's crawling. All right, so let's take a moment here and do our second exercise and do a bit of a sitemap analysis. So the first thing we're going to do is list all of the pages on your website that you think are important. So it doesn't have to be every page, but the ones that you think are most important, and then list them in order of most important to least important. Chances are your home page is going to be the most important page, and then there might be certain other pages underneath that are slightly less important, but still you really want to focus on and make sure users reach that page. So this is just a basic list of your pages, and just list them out by URL. And then what we're going to do is look and make sure your website has an XML sitemap. So you can use SEO Meta in one click. Now, I should preface this by saying if your site doesn't have a sitemap, that's not the end of the world. It's just going to take a lot longer for Google to understand your content and to crawl it. So if I were to add a new page and update my sitemap, my XML sitemap, and submit it to Google Search Console, your site will probably be indexed the next day. that particular new page that you added is going to show up right away. If you don't do that, it could take weeks or even months for Google to potentially get around to crawling that new page. So we want to just double check and see if we have one. And then if you do have an XML sitemap, what you're going to do is just go to that page. You might have to potentially kind of poke around a little bit and see what's showing, but then just look at the URLs in your sitemap and see if those pages are in the same order as your list. Are there weird pages in there that don't exist anymore, that shouldn't be in there? Are there pages that are at the top of the list that are really not important to you? Just look at that sitemap and see what the actual pages that are showing up there. And this might require you to chat with your developer a little bit too. Again, one of the challenges with SEO is just having a developer to work with and to implement some of this stuff. But just chat with them a little bit if you need to about how this particular sitemap might have been created and who is responsible for it. But we just want to verify that what we feel are the most important pages are also reflected in our XML sitemap. And then check to see if your website has an HTML sitemap. Usually these are found in the footer of a website, and it'll literally say a page that just says sitemap. If you don't, not the end of the world. They are, as I mentioned, a little bit of an older technique, but still can be useful. And if you don't have an HTML sitemap, what pages would you add? How would you go about actually creating an HTML sitemap? And would you still want to list these in order of most important to least important? So what would that look like if you were to actually create an HTML sitemap page? So let's just take a few minutes here and we'll go through this exercise, and then we will come back and finish off the rest of the module. All right. So I know we've covered a lot of technical things here. We've talked about internal linking and 301s and 302s, and we've talked about XML sitemaps. Again, this is as technically complicated as this course is going to get, but these are such foundational things to SEO that almost anything else that we're going to cover in this course will not work or do anything unless we make sure that all these foundational elements are as effective as possible. So we really have to nail down this technical stuff, even as challenging as it can be, just to make sure that our site is crawlable and as far as Google goes. So the next thing we're going to talk about is removing duplicate content. So Google loathes duplicate content with every fiber of its mathematical algorithmic being. And that's because duplicate content confuses both users and it's very confusing to Google. Also, back in the day, people would often try to game the system with Google when the algorithm wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it is now. They would try to game the system by creating the same content across 15 different pages and then hope that Google would pick that information up. So Google also kind of bears that in mind, that they've been burned by people doing that. So they hate duplicate content. They're going to penalize sites that they feel have duplicate content. And by that I mean content both from a kind of standard view of it in terms of the copy on a page, but also little technical elements to things like page titles and meta descriptions, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But it hates those too, if those are duplicates of one another. And Google's not just going to penalize one page that's a duplicate of another page, it's going to penalize both of them. So if you have two pages and Google thinks, hey, these are duplicates of each other, it's going to ding both those pages, not necessarily just one of those pages that it considers to be a duplicate. So this is just a bad experience across the board and something that we want to avoid and get rid of if we can. So why would your site have duplicate content? You're probably thinking to yourself, I don't know if my site actually does have duplicate content on it. But chances are it probably at least has a couple of pages that are duplicates that you might not even be aware of. The common reason for this is due to technical issues with development, and some of the common ones are page variants. So believe it or not, almost every website has a whole range of variants. There's a version that has a www, one that doesn't have a www. There's often one that's an HTTP and one that's an HTTPS. An HTTPS being that your site is considered secure. That's the only difference between those two. Also, a lot of sites have, and you would never even know this exists, but they'll have a page that ends with a trailing slash and one that doesn't have a trailing slash. So you might actually have, 8 potential pages that are duplicates of each other, and you wouldn't even know it just because it's something as simple as having a slash at the end of your URL versus not having a slash. often what happens is people will make a new page without old identical page being deleted. And I'm guilty of doing this myself, where I publish a page and oops, there's a spelling mistake in the URL. I'm just going to go ahead and make a new page and fix that. Well, I didn't do a redirect, and now that old page exists, it has exactly the same content, and my new page exists, and the only difference between them is the URL. So Google is going to consider those duplicates of one another. That could also be the case too if we reuse content across multiple pages. So if we have the same page title and we're using it across 50 pages, or we have the same kind of block of content and we're using it across all those different pages, that's going to be an issue too. And then some of this is going to be things that are outside of your control, but coding and site structure issues, oftentimes that's a big issue where we'll see content being considered to be duplicates. And again, bear in mind, a user might be able to reasonably understand that, hey, these are not duplicates of each other. I understand something's going on. But remember, Google's an idiot savant, and it's going to look at some of those content and think, yes, this is duplicate of each other. And it's not smart enough to kind of make that logical leap and understanding that this duplicate content, one, can be reasonably ignored. So we want to make it as easy as possible for Google to find content and to ignore duplicates. And we really want to remove this issue. Just as an example, and this might be a little hard to look, so you might have to get a little close to your screen to take a look at this, but below is from Nike.com, and these are 2 pages. Now, if you were to look at this, you would say, this is a single page. What is the difference? Everything looks exactly the same. So we're going to kind of do our Sesame Street, can you spot the difference here? And believe it or not, there is actually a difference. So take a second here and see if you can identify what the difference is between these 2 pages. All right, have you spotted it? If you guessed that one URL has a trailing slash and one does not, you would be correct. There is the one on the left that actually is Nike.com, ends in a trailing slash, and the other does not. So Google would consider these pages duplicates of one another. But Nike has actually done a number of things to make sure that doesn't happen. But structurally, this just exists. For whatever reason, probably something to do with their backend or coding, Nike created 2 versions of these pages. And this happens all the time. There's going to be tons of sites that do this. Now, it's going to make sure that the user ends up on the page that they need to get to, and Google's also done, Nike's done a number of things just to make sure that these pages aren't going to be identified as duplicates, which we'll chat about. But just wanted to illustrate here that this is really a simple example that happens all the time, where there's even big brands are going to have 2 different versions of the same page that could be considered duplicates if they aren't handled properly. So, what I'd like you to do now in terms of our third exercise is go to the home page of your website. And this is not just a random exercise. This is actually a first step that a lot of SEOs do when they're trying to identify SEO issues and just looking for duplicate content. They'll actually do exactly what we're going to do here in this module. So go to the homepage of your website and look and see, is there a trailing and a non-trailing slash version? So is there one that ends with a slash and one that does not? And does the user end up where they need to go? Then look and see, does your site have a www version and a one without a www version? And also, next we're going to check if there's an HTTP version and an HTTPS version of the site. And then what we're going to do is, as we check these, do they all redirect to the same homepage? So, example here with this Nike one is that if someone were to enter in the non-trailing slash version, they're going to end up where they need to go to the trailing slash version. Does that happen to yours, or does it treat those both as separate pages? If it does, and it doesn't redirect the user to where they need to go, that's a problem. That means in Google's eyes, your homepage has 2 or more duplicates of each other, which Google hates. So we want to make sure all these redirect to the single homepage. And I've actually worked on some sites that have something like 10 or 12 different versions of homepage. They have one with the www, one without, and in some cases, those have not redirected to each other. So somebody created them and just never thought about it, and Google is considering those to be duplicates of one another. So just take a few moments to do this, and then also, just as a last thing, look if there are any other pages on your site. Now, you don't have to necessarily dive too deep in this, but just think about, what are the big risks on my site that could potentially be duplicates of each other? If you're an e-com site or you sell a lot of things online at all, just bear in mind that maybe you have products that are very, very similar to each other. and the content stays the same and maybe only a few things change. So just look and see if maybe those might be some issues as well. So let's take a few moments and go through this exercise, and then we will move on to the rest of the module. All right. So now that we've understood a little bit more about just how ridiculous duplicate content and how minute, and again, for users, they're like, one has a duplicate, one has a trailing slash, one doesn't. Who cares? Google cares. Google is an idiot savant, and they're not smart enough to just ignore one. They don't know what the best thing to do is, so they're going to penalize both those pages if they're both kind of doing their own separate things. So the best way to avoid duplicate content is by using something called a canonical tag. Now, this has a very fancy sounding name, but it's actually a very simple little piece of code the way it works. So really what it does is it's just a little tag that we add to a page, and it tells Google that in the event that for whatever reason a user comes across a page that might be a duplicate of another one, treat one page as the most important, the canon, just like how that term's used when we refer to books. You know, there's the Shakespearean canon, the Western canon. We're saying it's the most important. So we're telling Google, this page is the most important, and any other pages that, for whatever reason, might look like it and have duplicate content, ignore those. Users can still get to those pages, but Google, save your crawl budget. Do not bother crawling these pages. There's only one that we care about. So that's a bit hard to wrap your head around, and it's got a really fancy sounding name. What does it actually look like? It looks like this. It's a little simple piece of code that literally that is all that is added to your page. It's added at the top of the source code of your page. You'll probably need a developer to help you do that, but every page on your website should have a canonical tag on it, just to make sure that for whatever reason, it can happen all the time that duplicate content is created in weird, random, insane ways that you're not even thinking of or not even aware of. We want to make sure that we always have a canonical tag on our website on every single page. So, how can we see the canonical tag of a page? Once again, we can use SEO Meta in one click. And that, on the summary tab of the Chrome extension, is going to show us what the canonical tag of that page is. So you'll note here for the social school, the canonical is the same as the fine. But if for whatever reason something happened in the back end and it made another random version of the homepage, maybe it made one without this trailing slash, maybe it made a HTTP version, maybe some other weird thing's going to happen to this homepage at some point that's out of our control, some development glitch, who knows? We want to make sure that Google is not going to crawl those other pages and consider them to be duplicates. And index those pages or try to index them. We only want Google to crawl this canonical version. So there's literally a piece of code on this page that is saying this is the canonical tag. So we are going to use this little Chrome extension just to see what the canonical is of the page. In most of the cases, it's probably going to match up with the URL, but you might see some pages that have different canonical tags than the one that's actually than the page they're actually on. And that could potentially be a bit of a red flag or something you need to think about. So that's how you can look and see if you have a canonical tag. So it's hard to wrap your head around this, and it's one of the more complicated crawlability things, and probably one of the most complicated and confusing things from an SEO standpoint. So how does this actually work? So let's just take a moment and do a solid example of what this looks like. So here's Nike.com again, and we can see that all of these running shoes below, the URL and the images change as I look at different colors, but everything else on the page stays the same. So that means that Google could consider these pages to be duplicates of each other because pretty much all of the content on the pages is identical. The only thing that slightly changes is the URL, and the only thing that changes is the image. And Google's been burned by people using that as a tactic in the past to try to game the system and rank for multiple pages for the same thing. So Google doesn't like that, and they're going to say to Nike, hey, these pages are all pretty much the same thing, so it's going to take us a long time to crawl these, A, and B, which one do we show to the user? Do we show them the black one? Do we show them the red one? Do we show them the white one? What's going on here? Maybe we should just penalize all these pages. So, fortunately, the SEO team at Nike was smart enough to address this issue. And what they did is there's a canonical tag that appears on every single one of these pages, because again, the URL changes of them, and it says the one with the pink shoes is the canon. That's the only page to index. Somebody deliberately chose that particular page, so maybe that's the most popular model. You'll note that if you look from left to right from the little icons of the shoes, that's the first one they are showing. So maybe that's the most popular version of the shoe. But rather than trying to get Google to index all of these pages, which could potentially cause duplicate issues, Nike is just saying, and there's literally a piece of code on that one primary page and on all the pages that just says, this is the canon, ignore all these other pages. Now, users can get to those pages just fine. They can click on them. The URL is going to change. The image is going to change. But Google is not going to bother crawling those pages. So we're saving Google some trouble from having to do that. And we're making it easy for Google to crawl the pages and not waste any budget crawling pages that aren't important. And from an index standpoint, we're only going to make sure that this page shows up. So that if somebody searches for Nike Air Vapor Max Flyknit 3 women's shoes, they're going to see this primary canonical page show up in the search results, and all of those other ones are going to be ignored. So that is a really great example of how canonical tags are used. And they're often extra important for e-commerce sites like Nike that are selling a lot of different versions of the same product online. But they're also important even if you're not an e-commerce site, just because there's a ton of weird ways that duplicate pages can be created. All right, so now that we have a basic understanding of canonical tags, and again, if you have any hard time wrapping your head around this, you might want to just go back over the past section here and just kind of refresh yourself. But these are really important to address, and actually not as complicated as it sounds or it might seem. It's really just a very simple little piece of code that's telling Google this is the most important page, and ignore duplicates. So go to 3 to 5 of the most important pages on your website, and then just use SEO Meta in one click to find out if those pages have canonical tags on them, and then look and see what is the canonical tag. Is it different than the URL of the page? Well, that might be potentially a problem. Is it the same, or does it not have a canonical tag on it at all? And do you think that because of that, either having canonical tags or not, are there going to be any issues that might come up with that? And then also, again, from the previous exercise, if there were any pages that you thought might be duplicates, especially if you're an e-com site, just look at those pages. If there's a single page that has 10 different versions of it with a slight change per page, just look at those and think, hey, is there something in these pages that might be flagged as duplicates? And look and see if those pages have canonical tags on them. If they don't, that could potentially be an issue, and it could be why those pages aren't ranking well, or it could be a sign of a larger problem. So just double check those other pages that you think might be duplicates as well. So let's just take a couple moments and we'll go through this exercise right now. All right. Next, we're going to chat about saving crawl budget. So, again, we chatted a little bit more about this earlier, and we chatted about this in the first module, but what is crawl budget? Most people think, hey, I've got a website. Google's going to crawl every single page on my site. We know from our first module that's a huge myth. Google's not going to do that. It's actually a little bit lazy. Google's only going to spend a certain amount of effort and time and resources crawling a site, and that is called crawl budget. So based on the popularity and authority and a whole bunch of other signals of your site, Google essentially assigns you a crawl budget, and this is how much time and effort they're going to spend crawling your site. So that could be a big challenge for massive sites like Amazon that have millions of pages. Google understands that Amazon's an important source of information for users, but even still, how much effort are they going to spend doing that? So there's entire teams at Amazon that are focused on maximizing crawl budget for a website. But it can even be important to smaller websites too. Why are we wasting Google's time to crawl pages that aren't important or that don't really matter to us from a search standpoint? That's just a waste of Google's resources, and that means that Google might potentially not reach other pages. But more importantly, if we help out Google, Google will help out us. If we make it easier for Google to crawl pages and save its resources where it can do the most good, Google's going to love us for that. And it's a simple way to make sure that we maximize our rankings. So To get the most out of Google, we really want to maximize the crawl budget of our site. So how do we do that? Well, it's simple. We actually tell Google to ignore pages that aren't important. We're essentially saying to Google, hey, don't bother even looking at this page. I know you're going to take a bunch of time. You're going to have your spiders do this. You're going to have to go and index it. You're going to make a copy. You're going to do all this stuff in the back end. Hey, guess what? We're just going to save you the hassle. We're going to tell you right now, don't even do it. Don't even crawl this page because we don't care if it shows up in search results. And Google's going to say, oh, really? That's awesome. Thanks for saving us some time and effort. And because of that, they're going to likely to reward your site. So you're going to get kind of two benefits from that. One is you're going to make Google happy, which is always a good thing. We want to make it as easy and simple as possible for Google to crawl our site. And the second thing is that we're not going to have pages that aren't even important start to show up and be ranked on search results. So what do I mean by pages that should be ignored? You're probably thinking to yourself, I want Google to crawl every page on my site. They're all awesome. That's actually probably not true. Chances are you probably have a few pages on your website that you could get Google to ignore and that Google is actually crawling right now that it doesn't need to, and it's just wasting crawl budget crawling these pages. Just some examples of some of the most common, and there's a ton of them out there, but these are a few of the most common. Login pages. You might want this to be indexed and crawled, but a lot of times if it's an employee login portal or something like that, why bother getting this page crawled? No one, the only people who go to it are people who already have it bookmarked or know it exists. No one's going to search for it on Google. So you could just say to Google, hey, ignore this page. I don't care. Maybe you have some internal employee-facing pages too. So you don't want the general public to get on these pages, but they're not super secure. They're not like company secrets or anything like that. They're employee-facing. You want employees to be able to get to them, but you don't want the general public to see these pages. So you would tell Google, hey, ignore these pages. Users can still get to them if they need to within the site, but we don't want them to show up in search results. Also, thank you pages. We don't really care if these show up in search results. This occurs after a user makes a purchase or signs up for something. Often they'll get a page that says, /thank you and thanks them for making their purchase or signing up. And no one is ever going to really care if this shows up in search results. But Google, being an idiot savant, is still going to go ahead and crawl and try to index that pages. You might also have some outdated pages. Maybe Gary from accounting, he loves these internal pages. They talk about some stuff. Gary wants you to keep having those pages so he can get to them and find the information he needs. But you don't care. They're outdated information. It's not accurate anymore. So you don't want that to show up in Google search results. So you would ask Google to ignore those pages. And there's also certain types of resource files. Believe it or not, there is a ton of code that is created as URLs. And we'll actually look at this a little bit later when we do some more detailed crawls of our sites. But there's actually tons and tons, sometimes it's hundreds if not thousands of pages that are actually just a piece of JavaScript or a code or a CSS file or some weird random code element. And we don't necessarily care. In a lot of cases, we do want Google to crawl those files because it kind of helps us. But there's some code elements that we can just ask Google to ignore, and we don't care if they're showing up in search results. So those are just a few of the types of pages we would ask Google to ignore so that Google saves crawl budget and it doesn't show irrelevant pages that we don't necessarily want people to look at anyways. So how do we get Google to ignore these pages? There's actually two ways we can help Google save crawl budget. What we can use are something called a robot.txt file, which again sounds very complicated, but I swear to you, bear with me, not nearly as complicated. And we can also use something called a noindex tag. Also sounds super fancy schmancy, also not nearly as complicated as it sounds. So what's a robot.txt file? This is a simple text file, just like if you're like me, I often use a text file in Notepad just to write things I have to do on a list, or it's just a very basic trimmed down text file. That's all it is. So what we do is we create one for Google and other search engines, and it tells them what pages to ignore. And you only need one robot.txt file per website. And you want to save it at the root directory of your website. So it would be yourwebsite.com/robots.txt file. And each robot.txt file has 4 components, and I'll show you an example of what this looks like in a second here. But these are really the 4 components. It's a user agent, so that is a simple way we just tell what search engines or bots can or can't crawl the site. Maybe we want certain search engines not to end up on our site, like we don't want Yandex or Baidu or some other. In some cases there's news Google has its own news bot. Maybe we don't want to show up in the news results, so we're going to block that. But most people will just say, hey, we're open for business. Anybody can crawl our site if they want to. The other thing is we can list all of the pages or a directory of multiple pages, if there's like 100 of them, that should not be crawled. So instead of us saying, hey, we don't crawl this single page, we're just going to give a whole big list of them to Google and just say, we do not want you to crawl these pages. And then we're going to say, we can have a section on allow that we do want to make sure that you're going to be crawled. By default, we don't really need an allow section. Google's going to try to crawl everything it can. But if we really want to make sure that a whole series of pages are crawled and we're worried that Google might not get to them, we might add an allow section as well. And then the last thing is we're just going to have a link to our XML sitemap, which we've already chatted about. So it's just another way for Google to get to that sitemap. Now you can submit your XML in Google Search Console, which we'll talk about a little later, or you can include it here in your robot.txt file as a way to get to it as well. So here's what it looks like. This is an example of Best Buy's robot.txt file, and you can see here bestbuy.ca/robots.txt. It's a simple file that's loaded at their root directory. So you can see here at the top, they have their user agent. They put a star, that's a wildcard symbol that just means any Google or search engine or any bot can end up on the site and crawl it. Then they have a whole list here of all the files and pages that they don't want search engines to crawl. So you can see certain things here like order, there's a /employee section with a whole bunch of content on it. And again, that's a great example of employee-facing material where Best Buy has new employees that are going to want to get onto that because they have to do some training. And so it's just easier to have it all on their website. But they don't want that stuff to be showing up in Google search results. So they're saying, here's a whole list of all these different things. You'll note they have things like themes. That's sort of the more of the content structural files that I was talking about. That's not important to be crawled. And Google's probably not going to show those in results, but it's still going to waste its time crawling those pages. So it doesn't want any of that stuff to be crawled. Then it has a few allow pages here too. And for whatever reason, they've decided to make sure that these pages that live in this particular and under these directories are crawled. So by default, Google's probably going to get to those anyways and crawl them, but Best Buy's just taking a little bit of extra time here to make sure that it is crawling those particular pages. And then at the bottom, just a link to Best Buy's XML sitemap, which we looked at a little bit earlier too. So just another way for Google to get to it. And that's all it is. It's just a simple text file that really shows the pages that they want to not be found. That's the most important thing, and then what bots can get to it. So every site should have one of these. If you don't have one, it's not the end of the world. Google's still going to crawl your site. But again, this isn't about giving Google access to our site. It's about making it easy for Google to find what it needs to and not to waste Google's time crawling pages that are irrelevant. So we don't want Google to crawl those employee pages because they're not something we care about showing up in search results. So we really want to save Google the time and hassle of crawling pages. So the other way to not get a page indexed and crawled by Google, again, we want to save Google the hassle of having to crawl a page that we don't care about showing up in search results anyways. So you can also do this using something called a no index tag. So this is a simple tag that you add to the top of your page within the code. And it looks like this little line of code here. A very, very simple little file that just says, don't crawl this page. That's all that content says. That's all that little code snippet says there. Probably need a developer to add this to a page. So you might have to talk with a developer on your team or a contract developer if you have one. But there's certain platforms like WordPress that actually have no index plugins. And all you can just say is, they'll say, do you want me to add a no index tag to this page? And you say, yes, check the checkbox, and it'll do it for you, and you don't have to worry about it. So really cool way to just make sure that you're able to add these. So a no index tag is one way to make sure that a page is ignored by Google, and a robot.txt is another. Again, we want Google to ignore certain pages because it's going to save them the hassle. So that way we know Google's going to not waste time crawling unimportant pages and instead focus only on the pages that are valuable to us because we're helping Google out. They're going to love us back. And we're also going to make sure that we're not having accidentally irrelevant pages show up in search results. So those are the two ways to do it. So what's the best option? Which one should you pick? Best practice is to use a no index tag if it's a single page. So if you only have a single employee procedures page on your site, that's the only page. You want employees to be able to get to it. It's not secret information or anything like that, you would just add a no index tag to that page, and then that's no problem. Google's not going to bother wasting crawl budget on that page. When you would use a robot.txt, on the other hand, is if you have a lot of pages. So you could use the laborious, time-consuming process of adding a no index tag to every page, but instead you could just see, and you can see this even with Best Buy's example here, that instead of just having on the /artist page, for example, for whatever reason, instead of just adding it to whatever, say there's 100 pages under there, they're just saying the entire /artist directory, just ignore that. So they could add no index tags to each of those pages, but instead it's just simpler to say, hey, here's all the pages that we don't want crawled in one foul swoop. So again, best practice, if you have a single page that you don't want crawled, use a no index tag. If there's a whole bunch of them, add all of the directory of that page to your robot.txt. And if all of this is still confusing, speak with your developer about doing this and make sure you're doing it accurately, because you could potentially get your site blocked from Google. So again, this is about making things easier for Google, but we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot either and potentially blocks pages that are really, really important to us. So if this is still a little bit confusing too, just ask you to kind of go back over what we just chatted about. But again, this is as technically complicated as it gets when it comes to foundational SEO, and it's as complicated as we're going to get in this course. So if you can wrap your head around this, you're going to be just fine. All right, so how do we see the robots.txt file? Once again, we're going to use SEO Meta in one click. Now, I should say here too, this isn't the only Chrome extension or the only tool to do this. There's a whole bunch of other ones. There's also a Moz Chrome extension, but this is one that I found really works really well and a lot of other SEOs end up using. So we can use this tool and we can see here, just like we did with the sitemap, XML sitemap, we can see if our website has a robot.txt file. And all we do is simply click on that link at the bottom of the summary tab, and it's going to show us if that particular site as a whole has a robot.txt file associated with it. So how can we see if there's a no index tag? Yep, we can also use SEO Meta in one click for that too, and that's going to be found in the summary section called the robots tag. So you can add a whole bunch of different robots tags, but if you do have a no index tag for a particular page, it's going to show up there, and it's going to actually say it's a no index tag. So that's how you see if a page has one without having to poke around in the code. You can just use this tool, and it's going to tell you if there is a no index tag on a particular page. So what we're going to do here for this next exercise is just look at our robot.txt and do a bit of analysis of no index tags as well. So use SEO Meta in one click and see if your website has a robot.txt file. Does it look accurate? And then what I want you to do is just make a list of all the pages on your site, if any, and chances are there are definitely some that you don't want Google to crawl. So login pages, thank you pages, those kinds of things. Just make a list of all those pages that you don't want Google to crawl. And then just think about the best way to avoid having Google crawl those pages. Should you, if there's a whole bunch of them, should you add them to your robot.txt file? Or if there's only one particular page or two particular pages, is it better to use a no index tag? So let's just take a moment to do that. Let's see if we have a robot.txt file. Think about pages we don't want Google to crawl and index, and then how we would actually go about addressing those. All right, next just want to chat a little bit about how to check crawlability. So we've chatted about a lot of complicated elements here. We've talked about redirects and 301s and 302s and canonicals and XML sitemaps. This is a lot to digest, especially if you're new to SEO. But again, we can't just ignore this stuff and move on to content and keywords. We have to do this foundational work before we can get to that. So is there an easier way to make sense of all of this? We've already used the SEO Meta in one-click tool, but that's a very high-level tool that's only going to really show us certain things. Is there something else we could use to help us make sense of something? So I want you to meet your other new SEO best friend, and that is a tool called Screaming Frog. Pretty awesome name. Also, I would say this is the best SEO tool on the market. Every single SEO specialist in the world, chances are they use this tool. It's one of the most popular, one of the most used tools ever. And also, there is a free version of this tool available. The caveat is it's exactly the same as the paid version. The only hitch is that it'll only let you crawl up to 500 pages. So if your site does have more than that, Screaming Frog is going to cap out and not be able to get to those. It also has a few other little features in the paid version, but for the most part, it's exactly the same. So what I'd like you to do right now is to download Screaming Frog. Now you can either do that by following this link here, and you'll find that within the course guide as well, or just Google Screaming Frog and download. It's going to show up in the search results, and you can download this particular tool and have access to it. So let's just take a couple minutes here and go ahead and download Screaming Frog right now. So take a second here, and then we'll come right back and chat a little bit more about it. All right, so chances are you now have Screaming Frog up and ready to go. So if you have any troubles installing it, just check out some of their help guides, but it's a pretty easy program once you have it installed. First thing you're going to do here is you're going to go to that main little drop-in area that I've highlighted up here where it said, you can see it says Social School, and after you've downloaded, that's just your home page. You're going to enter your home page in there, and you're going to click the Start button. And it's going to go ahead and start crawling all of the pages on your site. And you'll note that there's an export button. At any time, you can export all this data as a spreadsheet if you want to, or you can just go ahead and poke around in Screaming Frog and just look at it that way. So, first thing we're going to do here is, once you're in there, you're going to see this little status code section as well in Screaming Frog. So after the list of all the Screaming Frog information has come through and the site's been crawled, you can click that status code column, and it's going to return all of the lists. So anything with a 200 response means all okay, everything's great. And we already know that 301s are permanent redirects, and 302s are temporary redirects, which we don't want to see, and 404s we know are really bad page not found errors. So this is going to tell us all the different status codes and help us identify redirect issues and also page errors. And you might see also a 500 error that is a more of a hosting and database type error. So that would definitely involve having a developer fix. But the 404 error you should be able to work with your developer to fix, because again, we would address that by using 301 redirects. So this is going to show us just some of the big status issues that we can see with our particular website. Next, just scroll over at the bottom and you'll see there's a little scroll bar kind of at the bottom underneath all these search results here, all the different URLs. If we scroll that over a little bit, you'll see that there's also two columns called indexability and indexability status. So it'll tell you whether or not a page is indexable. So in other words, can it be found by Google, or is it non-indexable? If it's non-indexable, that means that page will never be found by Google, no matter what you do to it. So this is probably one of the most important features of this tool. You might have put all this effort into this particular page, and if it's showing up as non-indexable, that means Google is ignoring your page. So just take a moment here, and we're going to look and see what pages on your site are indexable and which ones are not indexable. And if you look at the indexability status, it's going to tell you why that particular page is indexable or non-indexable. So you can see here that, for example, we have a 302 page at the very top there. Now that says it's non-indexable. Why is it not? Because it's redirected. That's totally fine. We don't care if that page is indexable because it redirects off anyways. But if you'll also scroll down and look a little bit further here, you can see that there is the first 200 status code there. It says it's non-indexable. So 200 errors says, hey, everything's fine with this page, but it's saying this particular page is non-indexable because it's canonicalized. So we know that there's something on that page. There's a canonical tag on that page that is telling Google, this is not the right page. This is a page that is just fine. Users can get to this page, but it's not something we're going to index because there's another page that we consider to be the canon that's more important than this one, and we're not going to crawl this page as a result of that. So this is a really helpful way to kind of get a sense of what's actually happening with your site, and are there pages that are being indexed, And are there important pages that are not being indexed, and why? And once you have that why down, it's going to be the next big step is how you can actually fix it. So, because we know canonicals are also important, if you look up in the top right-hand corner there, you'll see that there's a canonicals tab. So you can click on that tab, and it's going to show all of the pages that have canonicals on them, and it's going to show whether or not they are being canonicalized and any other issues. And you'll note over in the bottom right-hand corner, I have this highlighted here, it's going to show you a breakdown of canonicals. So it's going to show all the pages that contain canonical tags. Self-referencing, so that means if I have the same canonical tag as the URL that I'm on, so if I have a canonical tag that's the homepage, that's totally fine. It's going to tell me that. And it's all going to identify any pages that have missing canonical tags as well. So just kind of a good way to get a snapshot of what's actually happening. But we know these are really important, especially because we want to avoid duplicate content. Duplicate content is, again, one of the worst things you can have on your site. Google's probably not going to even look at the content, but it's also going to penalize your site for having that. So we really want to focus on these canonical tags and just make sure that we have these properly in place and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Also, we already, in our earlier exercise in this module, we did create a sitemap on our piece of paper. In one of the exercises, we kind of mapped it all out here. If you want to look and see exactly what your site looks like in terms of how Google sees your site, you can click on that little site view button and it's going to give you a very more visual snapshot. Now you'll notice here that there's a whole bunch of other content and subdirectories that are appearing. So WordPress content, plugins, JavaScript, a whole bunch of extra stuff. And that's all resources that Google's going to potentially crawl. In a lot of cases, we do want to crawl that kind of content, but again, just showing you how Google considers your site as more than just pages. It's a whole different series, and this is really the flow in terms of how Google's crawling your site. So I wouldn't worry too much about this using this particular tab, but it can be helpful just to get a sense of how everything's connected and how all the different directories on your site and subdirectories are all connected together. And again, at any point, you can always export this data if you want to get a closer look at it. All right, so just for our last exercise here, we are just going to take a few minutes and let's do a Screaming Frog crawlability analysis. So if you haven't downloaded and installed Screaming Frog already, go ahead and do that. Again, here's the link, or you can just Google Screaming Frog download and you're going to find that. So first thing we're going to do is sort by status code. So look for 301s and 302s and 307s. Again, if you see any 302s or 307s, those are temporary redirects. We don't want those. We want those to be permanent redirects. And also look for 404 errors, page not found. That is a huge, huge issue. It could potentially be damaging to your website. In fact, even removing a few 404s can have a massive spike to rankings. And if you do see any of those issues, how are you going to go about dealing with them? So thinking about what the next steps are. In the case of 404s, you're going to want to use a 301 redirect on them. If you have any temporary redirects, you're going to want to change them into permanent redirects. So, and how are you going to go about doing that? Do you have to work with a developer? Is there one, if you're using WordPress or other CMS, is there a tool in there that can let you do that? How are you going to deal with that? Then I want you to sort by indexability. And are there any pages that aren't indexable but should be indexable? So are they pages you're saying, oh, what the hell, I want this page to be found on Google? What are you going to do about that? How and why is it not being indexed? So what's the plan to address with that? Again, if it's an important page and it's not being indexed, that means that page has zero value from a Google standpoint, and it will never show up in search results. No matter how awesome the content and how amazing it is, it's just not going to be found up at all. And then also just look at canonicals. And then are there any pages with canonical tag issues? Are there some pages that Google's saying, hey, we're not indexing this because it's got a canonical tag on it and it shouldn't be? And if so, how are you going to deal with this? So let's just take a few minutes to do this. And that is going to do it for module number 2. Again, I know this is a lot of information to digest when it comes to technical elements, so if you need to, go back over this. There's also some further readings which we'll chat about at the end of this course as well, but you have to do this foundational stuff before you can get onto the content and keyword side of things, because as we see with indexability, even if you have great content, if Google can't find this page, it is essentially useless from a search standpoint. So let's take a few minutes and do this, and then we will connect on with Module 3.